Hello, and welcome to the Curious Cult podcast, the show where we talk to incredible people about their fascinating curiosity. I am your obsessively curious host, Nick Haralambous, and today I'm privileged to be talking to Geraldine DeRuiter about her curiosity. Geraldine is an acclaimed author, world-renowned public speaker, and the voice behind the award-winning Everywhereist blog. While ostensibly a travel writer, Geraldine also writes about dessert, feminism, and a variety of other riveting topics. Time magazine described her work as consistently clever, and the New York Times said her writing was dark and hilarious. Her blog has received accolades from The Independent, Forbes magazine, and the Huffington Post, because sometimes feature editors get drunk, apparently. When not on the road with her long-suffering and infinitely patient husband, Rand, who is also a guest on this podcast, Geraldine can be found in Seattle, usually fighting with people on the internet. So the first question that I tend to ask, were you curious as a child?
Yeah, I was thinking about this a lot. And from what I remember, because it's hard to have perspective of who you were as a kid, right? So I was actually this very cautious and kind of anxious child by nature. I think it was by upbringing. My mother came to America right as I was born, basically. So I was the first child born over here. I was the first girl in that generation of my family. So everybody was super anxious, I think, just about what that meant. Like we have a girl now, and there had been 7 male grandchildren before me, and now there was me. And I was American, and I think that everybody freaked out a little bit. Everyone was super worried about me, and I wasn't allowed to go very far from the house, and there was a lot of restraints kind of on what I was allowed to do. That being said, my mother would tell me I would do things like, they would have plants around the house, like around the yard, and the plants would in the springtime have berries, and they were not edible plants, but I would still eat them. And I have a vague recollection of my mother like panicked fishing things out of my mouth.
Is that
S-
because you were hungry or curious?
yes. She said that was how I was experiencing the world. And
Amazing.
I like that concept. So I think I was, despite the restraints, I think I was a curious child.
And where did your family come from?
My mother's from Rome. So she left, but she actually left Germany to come to America. So it's kind of a convoluted story, but my father was from Ukraine, and then he and his family, when he was very small, almost got sent to the gulags, but they managed to make their way to Germany, which was under Nazi rule at the time. So not a great time for my grandmother or my dad or uncle. And so they ended up in a displaced persons camp in Germany, which is not the worst camp you could be in at the time, as my husband is
Sure.
so quick to remind me. And then they made it to New York. And then my father joined the US military and traveled all around. And he was stationed in Rome. And that's where he met my mother in the 70s.
Wow, that was a really well told précis of, I'm sure, a very long and complicated story.
I try and shorten it because all the details are bonkers. But yeah, they were very international. And my mom's still around, but my father passed away a few years ago. So unfortunately, I can't ask him all the follow-up questions that I have about his life.
I mean, that's a really interesting familial background because, as being Greek and half Greek, half Cypriot, my parents always had that phrase that they wanted for me better than they had for themselves.
Mhm.
And I'm sure you got that, but that made them relatively conservative in what better meant. And when you
Mm.
think of conservative, that means that when I told them I wanted to be a journalist and a war correspondent, they absolutely plutzed, to use an appropriate word. And they wanted me to be a lawyer and an accountant. So do you feel like your family's story led them to be more conservative or give you more freedom?
Gosh, it's a hard question. So because my parents split up essentially when I was born, I always say my mother left Europe and my dad in kind of one fell swoop. I got very different perspectives kind of from both of them. I would say the one unifying factor I got was, you are going to college and you are going to have some professional career that is intellectually uh, interesting, and taxing to some degree. I think that had it been, my father was in the military, in the US military for 45 years, and I think if it had been kind of him, I can't even say that. I would say that my father's perspective would have been more rigorous and, you need security and you need a job that is very stable, but at the same time, he was someone who did not dictate and very much wanted people to do their own thing. And then my mother is very bohemian and is just like, pursue your bliss regardless of whether or not it's financially
Yeah,
viable.
viable.
So yeah, so I would say that it tended towards choose your own path, but be responsible about it. And obviously, you are going to do certain things in a certain way, and that means you're going to get good grades and you're going to go to college. But because my mother raised me primarily, and she was more of this free spirit, I actually leaned towards more conservatism with my actions, and I'm a lot more like my dad. So yeah, so she and I always had friction, and the joke was that she was the teenager and I was the grown up.
That is very interesting. And aside from your parents, and I'm an exclude Rand,
Okay.
your doting husband, can you think of anyone in your life who sparked a deeper curiosity that led you down the path that you're on? Like, was there one person who you thought, oh man, I'm going to be an author, or I need to think about this thing,
Wow. I mean,
or many people?
I would say that there were a lot of writers who I read when I was younger, especially in those young formative years, that I thought, well, I want to do this. Like, this is the life that I want.
Can you name
And
some of them?
yeah, they're really obscure and it's kind of funny. So there was this author, Zilpha Keatley Snyder. I know. She's a children's book author, but she would write these books that were kind of I don't wanna say horror, but they were almost like thrillers for children, but very highbrow thrillers. So she wrote a book called The Headless Cupid and The Witches of Worm and The Egypt Game. They were they almost had these occult-like themes. There's one where a young woman gets a cat, that's The Witches of Worm, and the cat is possessed by basically this evil spirit, and it would talk to her, and eventually, like, she forms a sort of quasi-amicable relationship with this evil demonic spirit that's in her cat, and I know,
This is dark. How old
I
were
was
you?
10 reading this book,
That's
and then
amazing.
the cat essentially sacrifices itself to save her, and the cat survives, but the evil demonic spirit is purged. And she's sitting there scratching its head, and I'll never forget the line. She goes, "I'm sorry you died, worm. I really am." But the cat's alive, right? She's mourning the loss of this kind of spirit inside the cat. Super messed up book to read
I
as a
mean, who bought this
10-year-old.
book for you?
It was at the school library.
Wow.
It was at my
Okay.
elementary school library. And so I would read really strange I was checking out some really strange books at the school library. Why the school had these books, I have no idea. It was this tiny
Feels like that's a
school
whole
in
nother
New York.
episode on
Yeah,
why
we
they would have
will
those books.
I mean, there could be an entire story written about, like, they were like, "These books were not anywhere in the record, like, we don't know where they came from." So I loved that, but it was really strange and obscure stuff that I kind of pursued, and so that was one of the authors I remember the most. Then I read fluff as well when I was a kid. I read all of the Babysitters Club books
Okay.
religiously, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but
I'm not, no.
In the US, I think there's something like a conservative estimate is there's, probably 18,000 of these books, and it is about, a group of young women in Connecticut.
Which, by the way, is one of my favorite words.
Is it really?
Connecticut.
I know the spelling of it is bonkers, but
It's just so
you don't
fantastic.
pronounce the middle C.
Of course, but that's what makes
Yes,
it such an
but you
interesting word.
spell it Connecticut.
Yes, and I just love that. That's amazing.
Can I ask you something? Can you find it on a map?
No.
N I can't either, but I think it's more appalling that I can't. I have no idea about US geography. I am
Oh, that's
terrible
amazing.
at it.
I could
Yeah.
find you Colorado because I've snowboarded there, but that's like the limit outside of the big ones.
I think I could find Colorado.
Okay.
It's bigger and further south than you think it is.
Exactly how I remember it generally.
Yeah,
But it
and
just goes
very
to show that
square.
your curiosity does not extend to geography, and that is okay.
Yeah, not at all. Not at all.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about these books when you were a kid. Did they kind of spark you to go, let me think about what like demonic possession is? And then did you go down the rabbit hole there?
I I didn't, but what they did do is I just it fed me wanting to read more of them. So if I read and what I would do is and I still do this, if I find an author I like or if I find kind of a maker of any kind, so a musician or a celebrity or a director or anything that I like, I will essentially binge it. So I did that as a kid. I would find one author, I would find it would be Lois Lowry or it would be Snyder, who I was mentioning, who wrote all those occult like books, and I would just plow through them. And to this day, I still do that. I found an author I liked earlier this year and I read 4 of her books in a month. And there was yeah, it's bonkers. It's just I get very excited and I just wanna consume more, and there was a time when Rand and I were dating early on, and I had this obsession with Cary Grant, uh, and I would refuse. Like, I was like, "I don't" and this was back when do you remember when Netflix would send you the DVDs?
We didn't have that
You
version of Netflix
didn't.
back deep in South Africa, but I'm well
Okay.
versed in the story.
Okay, yeah. So for those of your listeners who may not be familiar with how it works or how it did work, is there was a time in the kind of early to mid 2000s where you would get a Netflix subscription and it was based on how many DVDs they could send you
Yeah.
at once. And so I think it was something like $10 a month and they would mail you DVDs. And Rand and I went through this was our entertainment when we were kind of young and broke. And I refused to watch anything but Cary Grant movies. I was like, no, this is what I want to watch. So we went through a ton of Cary Grant movies and we eventually branched out. I think he got me to watch like some Jimmy Stewart. But yeah, so that my curiosity, I think Rand's comment about obsessiveness is a very good way of characterizing it. I don't it sounds like that's how he characterized it for himself, but I think that probably applies to me too.
And interesting, I think it's going to be a consistent theme as I uncover more and more about curiosity with each of my guests. It
Mhm.
does seem like obsession is the thing that for whatever reason you become hooked and you just obsess until you are an expert, basically,
Right, right, or just weird.
or just weird and saturated.
Yes, weird and saturated. That's a great way of putting
Um,
it.
So I wanted to ask how you choose what to focus on when this curiosity kind of sparks. I think there's this theme amongst entrepreneurs, authors, and anyone who's conscious of their life at the moment that it's more important what you say no to than what you say yes to. And for me, when curiosity sparks, it's just like we say, it's obsessive. And I have to force myself to go, okay, no, I don't want to spend the next 10 years discussing this in my life. Like, let me find something else. Or, hell yeah, let's go as deep as we can go. Like, how do you curate what you choose?
So it's interesting because I would say there are kind of 2 aspects to my curiosity, and there is the personal and there is the professional, and sometimes they intertwine and sometimes they don't. And so on the personal, it is a lot more freeform and I can sort of pursue whatever I want until I get exhausted with it or bored or hit a dead end. And I think that's what a lot of people do. And so it becomes, all right, I'm going to watch this TV show until I grow tired of it. I'm currently throwing pottery on the wheel. I don't know if you've
Okay.
ever done that.
No, but my partner Jen has.
Yeah.
And she's quite familiar with that. So I've watched her, all of our dinner plates and bowls, she has made herself.
Oh, that's awesome. That's really
Yeah.
cool. Yeah, so I've been doing that for the last year and a half, and I really enjoy it, and so I'm still pursuing that, right? I haven't gotten tired of that.
Cool.
And one thing leads to another where it's like, well, I'm throwing pots on the wheel. Am I going to hand build clay, which is, just forming it on its own and doing something there. So all of that has kind of been choose your own adventure, you know? And there's no direction, and so it's fine as long as it doesn't interfere with work.
Okay.
Now the problem is, of course, it does. And so right now, I'm working on a new book, and I'm working on a fiction book, which is different than anything I've ever done before.
Okay.
And this is deeply nerve-wracking, and part of the thing that people tell you is that you need to when you're working on a book, is that you need to read in the genre that you wanna write in. And
Mhm.
that's one of the best ways to essentially practice and get research done. So, I am one of the main tracks to getting any book done is that you need to step away from the book and read other books. And that in itself is its own wormhole.
Yeah.
And which is can be dangerous, I told and there was I've gotten a bit better, but there was a point earlier this year, I think it was January, Rand came in from his office, which is in the back of our house. He came in and I was sitting at the kitchen table and I had been sitting there since breakfast, and it was now 1 PM, and I was like, "Oh god, I had just picked up my book to read during breakfast, and now, 3 or 4 hours have gone by." So that is something to kind of keep tabs on, and then the other thing is, I'm doing research specifically for this book,
Mm.
which is I'm not comfortable talking about the book yet, it's too early, but I
Perfect.
can
So,
talk about the research, which
yes.
is I've been going down these wormholes of, uh, shipping patterns and how cargo ships move through the Columbia River, which is a major waterway that runs between Oregon and Washington State, and I live in Washington State, and what happens is ships will come from, Japan or Korea, sometimes they will come up from further south, from Mexico, and they will come down the Columbia, they will stop in Astoria, and then they will head back up to Vancouver, they might head to Seattle, they might go to Portland. And I'm listening to shipping podcasts about the shipping patterns of cargo ships and what they carry. And I went down this wormhole, and so, like, I had all this information, and I didn't want to blurt it out to some poor, like, innocent person in my house, but, of course, we have friends over for brunch, and we're talking about it, and I'm like, "Well, a lot of what they take through the Columbia is soda ash," and somebody goes, "Well, what's soda ash?" And I'm like, "I'm glad you asked. It's used in the creation and refinement of glass." Anyway, the way that you can tell which cargo ships are carrying soda ash is this. And I'm like, I need to calm down because the excitement that I feel about this is not comparable to the excitement that anyone else will feel. So that's the wormhole that I'm down now. And like a lot of grain comes through this area. And I was researching how grain is loaded onto ships. Because if you asked me, I would assume that the grain would come in containers of
Yeah.
some kind. No, they open the hull of a ship and then they
No.
literally yes.
Wow.
They clean out the hull of a ship, of these massive cargo ships.
That doesn't feel very sanitary.
So, apparently, because the grain hasn't been refined yet, it's kind of
Ah.
okay. And so they do have a lot of, sanitation checks, so they have to check for why are you asking me follow-up questions? Look what I'm doing, Nick. I'm
But
talking about
this is the essence of this entire podcast, and,
right?
you know what the word that I was gonna use? Infectious.
Yeah,
Curiosity is infectious because I am riveted by learning this because you are.
right. It's so
Like,
weird.
I genuinely wanted to know if that was sanitary. I wasn't asking to be polite.
Yeah. No, and I wondered that too. I'm like, "How is it clean?" But apparently the refinement happens afterwards, so it's just almost like a raw material. Yeah, and I could talk about how I could talk about grain transport and cargo ships for probably another half hour. But this is where, you go down these wormholes, and
Yeah.
it's very strange. It's answering questions that you didn't know you had.
Precisely because you're following this really odd obsession that you've
Yes.
discovered.
Yes.
Yeah.
And one thing that you kind of mentioned, and one thing that you asked me earlier is, how do you know what to follow and what to let
Yeah.
go? I think that that's a really hard question to answer. And what I have found is a lot of times for a book project, I just start doing all of the research with the understanding that not all of it is going to make it into, the article that I'm working on or the book that I'm working on. But I know that it's in a way it's almost world building. And so you have that information. So if you need to, it can come in. And you also can make sure that you don't break any rules because you know what that world looks like. So I'm not going to, if I'm writing about grain transport, I'm not going to say that they're hauling bags of grain because I know
Yeah.
that's not true. Even if it never comes up, I know not to make those mistakes.
Well, absolutely, because it breaks that wall of trust that your reader has with you if you're saying the wrong thing and one of them happens to know.
Yeah.
So your curiosity is actually just building your foundation to be more authentic.
Absolutely. You need to become an authority, and I'm sure you've experienced this. If you know about a topic that is featured in TV or in a book, and you know something that the author or the writer or the producer doesn't, it yeah, it shatters for you.
Yeah. Absolutely. Something I dealt with my psychologist, who I call my mental coach, to help
uh
people be a bit more comfortable with me talking about it.
Oh, well,
Um,
the good news is, and I don't know if you noticed, is, like, that there is no stigma about therapy in the US mostly.
And that's great. So I
Yeah,
always preface this because other readers in less open communities, sorry, other listeners, they struggle with the idea. So men in South Africa, it's a big
yeah,
no-no. You do not
yeah.
go to seek therapy. It's like a negative thing. My psychologist helped me to realize that I have this problem with growing my knowledge base, that I thrust that knowledge upon other people, whether they want it or not, and I
Mhm.
manipulate conversations. So I will find ways at dinner parties, or I used to at least, to target the conversation towards a topic that I'm researching and then overwhelm everyone with that topic until they choose to leave. So my curiosity actually manifests itself in relatively negative ways too, because honestly, what's good for me is not good for everyone else. And I force it on people because I'm quite a manipulative talker. So it's interesting that you also find yourself having to pull back at brunch talking about refineries and things.
Oh, I think it's a pretty common thing. We all wanna talk about the things that we wanna talk about.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I think that that's a kind of a universal tendency, and so, yeah, I don't I a lot of that I would say falls into the realm of just being human, and then you have to
Yeah.
kind of check it and be like, "Okay, what's the empathetic response here?" The empathetic response is to not overwhelm everyone, but that's hard, especially when
It
you're
is. It's so
excited
hard.
about something.
Yeah, when you're passionate, absolutely. Okay, so you did mention personal life and the professional life.
Mm,
I I'm interested in that frivolous nature of curiosity. So when I talk to businesses, I try and help them understand that curiosity is not an efficient way to arrive at a solution, but often it is the best way. So I am curious about how you factor in, okay, I need to do work now, or I need to do frivolous curiosity. Like, how do you actually define those two things? Because doesn't the one get the other? Aren't you thinking about writing when you're throwing clay?
I'm absolutely thinking about writing when I'm throwing clay, and I'm thinking about throwing clay when I'm writing, and I think that you need that because you need to step away. It's how our brains are able to kind of function, right? Is that if we stay too long on one project, we'll go bonkers. And so you need to think about the other project, or you need to like walk away And then all of a sudden, your brain has space to be able to think about, if I'm trying to resolve a plot issue or I can't seem to get over a certain paragraph or something, I find that if I go for a walk or if I distract myself or you kind of pursue that other path of interest, you are able to relax your head enough, get it out of the space it's in to be able to do the work that needs to be done. So, I don't know if that answers your question, but I
No,
think
it
that
does. Yeah.
I think the thing is there's no clear line of demarcation, at least for me, between the 2, and I think that's why I have so much trouble getting things done.
And with that said, I think that's how you feel about life. But from the outside, you have successfully published books, you have a successful blog, you have a successful Twitter account, you have a successful personal life. So I suppose my point is we always feel like we're distracted and not achieving when actually our distractions are achievements.
Wow. Can I just need you like a recording. Obviously, I will have that once the show goes up. I just need a recording of you saying that repeatedly because that is
Yes,
it's so
because I need that
affirming.
too.
It's so affirming. Well, and it's funny too how I always thought about a lot of these things in a very negative light. So Rand and I will be watching TV and I have very good facial recognition and very good name recognition, which is great for him because he doesn't. So
Okay.
we will go to conferences and he will see someone who he knows and who he likes. He's like,
Yeah.
"I know that person. I like that person. Oh god, what is there?" And I'll pull him aside and I'm like, "That's so and so. They're
Yeah.
married to this person. They have 2
Yeah.
kids. They live here. Here's where you last met them." And he's like, "Right." And I just see, like, the anxiety leave, and he goes and talks to that person. And so I have this facial recognition ability. And so part of it is when we're watching a TV show, we'll see someone and I'm like, "Oh, that actor was in this, that, and the other." And then I'm like, "What else were they in?" So, of course, I'm looking up their entire filmography on my
On
phone.
IMDb, yeah.
Right, while the TV is playing, and so then I'm processing all of that, and I always thought, "This is terrible, just pay attention to the show," but framing it as, "I am curious," really makes
Absolutely.
it less of a judgment, which I like.
And the next time Rand says to you, could you focus on the TV show? You can say to him, hey, I'm working on my facial and name recognition.
Oh, and
Thank you
he's
very
also
much.
learned never to add never
There you
he
go.
yeah, he knows what he married.
Okay, so tell me about what you think about innovation. Like, how would you define or explain it to someone? And obviously, it can be in your context. I'm curious about that word in relation to curiosity.
I mean, I think that innovation is a new approach to solving an old problem.
Huh,
I
that is
mean,
very
that's
succinct.
that's what that's what I think it is. I think from a dictionary definition, you probably have something different. I think innovation doesn't actually specifically talk about problem solving, but that's how I regard it. And in terms of curiosity, like I don't see how the 2 couldn't go hand in hand, right?
Yeah,
Like, you need to you
couldn't agree
need
more.
to
Yeah.
you need to go down these wormholes, you need to think about the problems, you need to think about the ways that other people have solved problems, and then, sometimes you need to step away from it all and go throw some pots, and suddenly you have the answer.
And the incredible part and the observation that I'm making through writing my book about curiosity and innovation is oftentimes people will want to innovate without doing the hard work of being curious about the problem. They want to just arrive at the innovation. And you can't. You unequivocally can't. You have to be obsessed with the problem.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely. You have to
yeah.
understand and I think that's true across a lot of things, like, this is really embarrassing, but my gym plays the TV show Shark Tank.
Uh-huh.
Are you familiar with this?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, I had never seen it before, but it plays on at my gym, and so I switch between that and CNN, which has been very bad
Sure.
for my psyche. And so one of the things that they always talk about, and I do think that this is really helpful, is they're like, "You have not understood the problem that you're trying to solve."
Mm,
And that's true. They haven't understood the customer base. They haven't understood the depth of the issue. And and I think that that's really important.
interesting. Okay, a couple more questions for you that are a little bit more topical. Um,
Okay.
did Did good old Mario Batali make you curious about cinnamon rolls and Martha Stewart, or was it just write that article and be done with it?
So I have always been a baker, and I've always had a pretty good wealth of knowledge about the science of baking. And I would say I bake to the point where, in the US, a lot of our recipes are not in measurements.
Mhm.
They're 1 cup or whatever,
Which is infuriating.
which is infuriating. I'm fed up by this, so I've just basically memorized most of it. So, I know a cup of flour is 128 grams, and a cup of cocoa powder is 100 grams. That one's easy. And a cup of sugar is roughly 225 grams if you're talking about granulated sugar. That has made it a lot easier for me to convert recipes, but that's the level, like that's how often I bake, right? That I've memorized all of this.
It's an
So
obsession, a deep obsession.
it is a deep obsession, and I go very deep down the wormholes of baking. And the other day, my mother, who is staying with us right now, came to the room and she's like, "What are you reading?" And I'm like, "A baking cookbook." I'm reading recipes. So I think I always had a curiosity about baking. And I think it was actually that curiosity and that knowledge that enabled me to look at his recipe and know how wrong it was. Because I knew from just looking at his recipe that
That it was wrong.
it wasn't gonna
A-
work.
And on so many levels too, not just the literal sense.
Oh, of course, yeah, on just the tone and appropriateness of it, you
Yeah.
don't do that. So, yeah, it absolutely was an example of just not being able to read the room on his part. And so, because I saw that it was wrong on these 2 vectors, I think I was able to write about it in that way. I was like, "Okay, like, you made a shitty recipe, and also what are you doing so I can address all of this?"
And isn't that a beautiful way to illustrate how your personal curiosities and obsessions can work so well with your professional life and they can come together in such unexpected and odd ways?
Yeah, it's really true. For me, I was just writing something that kind of in a lot of ways I wanted to write and that interested
Yeah.
me. And I was also shocked that no one had made, and for people who might not know or who might need background on this, Mario Batali, who was quite a famous celebrity chef here in the United States, and I think a little bit in Europe as well, he sexually harassed and allegedly assaulted, but I think the charges for the assault were dropped because there wasn't really enough evidence, or that somebody wouldn't testify. I mean, it's hard to get those
Yeah.
things prosecuted, as I'm sure you've heard. But he essentially had all of these allegations against him, and he sent out an apology letter for the allegations. And at the end of the apology letter, he included a recipe for cinnamon rolls. And everyone was horrified by this, understandably, but the thing that I thought was interesting is nobody bothered to make the recipe.
That is great. And then you
Yeah,
did.
a month went by and or no, like 2 weeks went by and no one made the recipe, and finally, I was on the road, and when I got home, I thought, "Okay, if nobody's done this by the time I get home, I'm going to do it."
Amazing.
Yeah.
So, a really relevant follow up question there, and this is a little bit more serious, but does Twitter make you curious or sad about the human race? You have a very prominent Twitter account. I love it.
Thank
And
you.
people love to hate you with your between your Joker and Martha Stewart, and like you must experience extremes on Twitter of humanity. So how does it make you feel? Curious
I
or sad?
I do experience extremes, on Twitter and just in general, it's really interesting. Yesterday, I got a little bit of hate, and then I got somebody who wrote to me and said, "I can't wait for you to finish this book you're working on because I really wanna read more of your stuff." So it's a
Yeah.
bonkers mix. I think it's both. I think it makes me curious, and then sometimes what I find is depressing, and then sometimes you're pleasantly surprised.
Did you happen to come across Tim Ferriss's blog post on his advice if you want to be famous?
No, I'll be honest, I have shied away from Tim Ferriss because of
Tim
that.
Ferriss. Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
fully.
What did he
This
say?
particular article was very poignant on the theme is be careful what you wish for. That
Mm,
he had to move. He's had to never mention where he's going. He's had to remove references of his family's names, his girlfriends,
yeah.
his business partners, because people will fly to where he's going to be and meet him. it's
Yeah.
it's it's bonkers. So I mean, I can only imagine what you're experiencing on Twitter is similar. That you get the absolute worst of the worst, and then these flashes of hope.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So we did get a home security system based on some stuff that we got on Twitter, just some creepy stuff that came through. And Rand was like, "Well, we should.
Mm,
There's no reason why we shouldn't do this." So we went ahead and got a home security system. And I don't blog as much about travel now,
sure.
but even when I did, I never blogged about it in real time, so I always blogged about a trip after we got home, so people would say, "Oh, I see you're in, Paris right now." I'm like, "Nope, I'm not.
I'm
I'm
smarter
home."
than you are, buddy.
Yeah, I'm home. And so that and I try not to post too much about where we're going or if we're not home. I try not to post that, so it's usually
Yeah,
after the fact if I do.
that makes
Yeah,
sense. Okay,
yeah.
and my final question: what is keeping you up at night right now?
The US election.
Okay,
Yeah,
want
the
to dive
upcoming.
any deeper into that?
No, yeah, I absolutely could. So, I mean, I don't know how familiar you are with our
Oh, the whole
system.
world is very familiar with your system,
Okay,
your primaries, the whole bang shoot. I mean,
okay.
Trevor Noah is in the Daily Show now, so
Yes,
everyone around the
he is.
world follows it.
Yeah. I mean, this is the interesting thing about American politics is that we are very insular, within America, but we blast it out. So everybody knows
Yeah.
what's going on with us, and we have the luxury and privilege of not really paying attention to what's going on with everyone else. Our elections are in November. And right now, we basically have 2 parties. There's some argument that we would have 3 parties, but we don't. Essentially, we have a two-party system. We have the Republicans who, Trump is the head of the Republican Party, and then we have the Democrats. And my family has always historically been a Democratic family. We're way more liberal and not at all conservative in any metric. And so right now we're looking for the candidate who will be the Democratic candidate for president. It is a very strange primary system where basically state by state delegates are assigned based on caucuses. So you go as a registered voter and you are not required to go, but you will go to a location and then you will organize yourself by district, and then you will say who you are supporting, and then you move into little groups, and it'll be like 15 people here and 10 people here, and based on how many delegates are assigned to a particular district, the number of people you have you'll be like, okay, well, we have 10 people here, that's one delegate. We have 20 people here, so that person gets two delegates. We have 15 people here and 15 people here. So that means there's three delegates between the two of those people. Who's going to get that second delegate? We're going to flip a coin. It's that ridiculous. Like it's a very arbitrary process and it's pretty broken. So we're in that process now. We're in the caucusing process. It is stressing me out because I just don't I think it's a broken system. And right now Bernie is the front runner. And I actually I he's not my first pick, but I like Bernie Sanders. But then there's a lot of questions about all sorts of things, whether he's
Like
elected,
whether he could beat Trump.
whether he could beat Trump. I kind of think he could, actually.
I mean, the whole world is hoping he could.
I mean, the whole world,
But
yeah.
I got to tell you, from the outside perspective, there really isn't a democratic system that does work. And as frustrated as you are with the two-party system, in South Africa we have what's known as a proportional representation system.
Mhm.
So anyone who gets sufficient votes will be represented in government. So we have at any time anything between 15, 20 different parties that are all represented in parliament. So if you win 300 votes, you get one seat in parliament and you get paid to be there. And our issue is that we have a split system. So all of the opposition tries to not give majority, which is 65% in South Africa. If they
Sure.
get 65%, they're allowed to change the constitution. And South Africa's constitution is one of the most progressive in the world. We were one of the first countries to legalize gay marriage.
I remember that in
Yeah, there's a whole
1998, maybe?
exactly.
Yeah.
There's a whole slew of things that we want to protect.
Curiosity, look at that.
Yeah, look at
Yeah.
that, right? So to make you sleep slightly better, there is no democratic system that actually works. That is what I've come to with my politics, philosophy, and journalism degree. We all suck, and we need a better version of democracy.
That makes me feel marginally better.
Yeah,
Um,
just marginally, and that's fine. That's all I was
marginally
going for.
marginally better, yeah, so our system is broken,
Yes.
and there's a lot of talk about Russian interference, and that is, terrifying, and the way that Russian interference works, I was listening to Gary Kasparov talk about this yesterday, is, obviously Putin is in favor of Trump, and he's made that very clear, and Trump is denying this, which is really interesting because Putin stood next to him, I believe they were in Helsinki, and literally said, I want Trump to be reelected. And so the fact that the president is denying that that happened is really alarming. So all of that, and the some FBI official, I can't remember who it was, said, the whole goal of Russia right now and the whole goal of Putin right now is to basically make sure that the US tears itself apart. And I think that they're doing a really good job.
Yeah, and it's not surprising that that keeps you up at night.
Yeah, so that coronavirus is stressing me out a little.
Fair. There is
Yeah,
enough stuff to keep you up at night.
yeah, and coronavirus, I don't know, it's interesting. It's not stressing me out because of, the way that a lot of people think. I've been talking to my husband about it, and he's like, "Look, it's only marginally, or it's not even more dangerous than the flu, I don't think.
No, no, it
It's just,
isn't.
it's
This
about
year alone, more people have died from the flu.
Yeah, it's less aggressive than the flu. But what I am worried about is the measures that countries are taking I don't
Mm,
think are good. So we're supposed to travel next month to Italy, which has the most cases of coronavirus in Europe. And my concern is that we might hit some bureaucratic barriers to where we end up getting quarantined or something
yeah.
happens. So that is something else that's kind of stressing me out. So,
Thank you. That is not stressing me out too.
oh, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Sure.
Also,
A
I've
shared
heard that
stress.
part of the reason that people are so concerned is just the way in which it spreads, which is it's a lot more contagious than the flu.
Mm,
Have you read a book called Station 11?
I have not, but I will add it to my Goodreads.
It's a wonderful book, and it starts with this deadly flu that basically ravages, almost all of humanity.
Love those kinds of books. Post-apocalyptic.
Yeah.
This is what the world will look like.
Yes, yeah, so it's
Yes.
basically present day, a flu ravages the world, and then it jumps forward about 20 years in time to what's left.
Amazing. I will
Yeah.
go and read that. And on that bombshell, I want to
Oh
thank you so
god.
much for giving me so much of your time.
Oh, thank
This
you.
was illuminating, and I can't wait for your second book to come out.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. I am so nervous about that. I'm gonna go research right now. I'm gonna go research
Brilliant.
shipping patterns. So,
Amazing. Geraldine,
alright.
thank you so much.
Thank you for your time, Nick. This was fun.
Thank you for listening to the Curious Cult podcast, the show where we talk to incredible people about their fascinating curiosity. If you like this episode, please rate the show, like it, share it, and generally be kind to us and tell people about it. My goal is to spark curiosity that changes the world, and you can help by talking about the show to anyone who will listen. Stay curious. Until next time.